Now, I think a couple of very interesting things to note about the first six Star Wars movies, or the original trilogy and prequels, is that, for one, time and or the measurement of it is rarely ever talked about or mentioned. Outside of a few examples in A New Hope, like Han saying they'll arrive at Alderaan at 0200, or the countdown till the Death Star fires on the Rebel base at the end of the movie, never do we really hear characters say how long something is going to take, or that it's going to be X amount of time before this happens, or that we'll be in hyperspace this long before we reach our destination. And speaking of hyperspace travel, another curious thing to note about the first six Star Wars movies is that's all it ever really is: travel. Outside of Han telling Luke in A New Hope, and us the audience really, that it's not like dusting crops and without precise calculations you could fly through a star or bounce too close to a supernova, we're given no details about how it works, how long it generally takes, or anything of that nature. And I'd argue both these things, time and space travel, which do go hand in hand, are intentionally kept very vague in the first six movies for a few reasons, though the main one is because when dealing with space and, shall we say, all the complications or things that potentially makes traveling through it messy for a story, like trying to keep track of how far apart systems are, or how fast ships generally tend to go, and so on, glossing over it, or all but ignoring it really, tends to just make things easier. As I jokingly like to say when asked how fast is hyperspace travel in Star Wars, well, it's as slow or fast as the plot requires it to be. And as long as you don't attach numbers or talk about how long it takes to do this or that or get here or there, most people are just going to assume that, especially when traveling through hyperspace, it's going to take quite a bit of time, which helps the galaxy feel massive in scale, but doesn't overcomplicate the story by needing everything to perfectly align in terms of time. And I'd say, for the most part, this approach of ignoring space and time, if you will, works in the first six Star Wars movies. Hyperspace travel tends to feel as if it takes quite a while in most instances, like you can't just hop across the galaxy in a matter of minutes. But keeping things vague can also lead to issues, or at the very least, rather curious questions, maybe the biggest of which in the first six movies is just how long was Luke on Dagobah training with Yoda, because at the same time that was happening, the Millennium Falcon was on its way from Hoth to Bespin without a working hyperdrive. Now, personally, and throwing out any type of consideration about space travel here, I've always got the impression from the movie that Luke was on Dagobah for maybe a couple weeks at most. And maybe you feel like it was only a few days, or maybe you feel like it could have been a month or two, or maybe more. But either way, I think it's safe to say that at the very most, he was there for a few months. He certainly wasn't there for a year or more. And yet, in that relatively short amount of time, somehow the Millennium Falcon makes it all the way from Hoth to Bespin, again without a working hyperdrive. And even if Bespin is just, let's say, 1 light year away from Hoth, which it isn't, it's much more, and without its hyperdrive it could still fly at somewhere near the speed of light, it'd take over a year to get there. And then when we, for fun, take something like relativity into account here, if the Falcon was traveling that fast, again, somewhere remotely close to the speed of light for over a year, and let's ignore the insane amount of energy that would take, time would be going much, much, much slower for everyone aboard the Falcon, to the point where Luke would have long since grown old and died by the time they got to Cloud City. Not that Cloud City would likely even still be around, not that even the Empire would likely still be around at that point. And even if we throw out relativity here, which I'm sure would displease Einstein, another problem we have is that Hoth and Bespin are not a mere light year apart. Again, they're actually a great deal further, something like 1,000 light years in fact. Though new canon maps of the galaxy put them right on top of each other, so perhaps that's changed. Perhaps they're even closer than that now, though they'd almost literally have to be right on top of each other to make that trip without hyperspace travel in only a couple of months. Either way, since they are relatively close to each other, at least on the galactic scale, perhaps we could say Han and Chewie were able to coax the hyperdrive into giving them a brief jump that got them most of the way there, or almost all of the way there, and then it just crapped out for good. When looking for somewhere to go, Han even says in the movie of Bespin that it's pretty far, but he thinks they can make it, which, if we want to give them the benefit of the doubt, we can construe to mean that Han knew or was pretty certain they could make one quick jump somewhere and just fly the rest of the way there at sub-light speed. Then there's also, of course, the answer the old continuity gave us, that the Millennium Falcon had a backup hyperdrive that was much, much slower than their primary one, and it took them weeks to get to Cloud City using it. In other words, there are ways to rectify this problem, and the fact that it's all kept so vague in the movie, or never actually addressed at all, lets us do that. Though sure, at the same time, it's certainly not the viewer's job to have to come up with ways to make the movie work. Either way though, it still holds true with the first 6 movies' approach to rarely mention, much less delve into, time and space travel. The sequel trilogy, however, especially The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, do not adopt this same approach about being vague when it comes to time and the workings of hyperspace travel, and I'd argue it's to their detriment. In fact, all 3 sequel trilogy movies do something very unique and different with hyperspace travel that shines a light on it and makes us ask a ton of questions about something that once was mostly left alone to, shall we say, be a background idea that didn't need to be given any thought or elaboration. Furthermore, 2 of the sequel trilogy movies even give us a very specific timeline for the story, or how many real-world hours it, or most of it, takes place during. In The Last Jedi, we're told when the slow space chase begins that the Resistance fleet has roughly 18 hours of fuel, and in The Rise of Skywalker, we're told Palpatine's attack will start in 16 hours. And oddly enough, we didn't really need to know those times. Yes, you could argue they add to the overall tension of the story, that we can put it into real-world terms and understand just how imminent the threat is, but giving them to us, again, ends up as more of a detriment to the story than anything else. For example, even though the opening crawl of The Last Jedi tells us the First Order reigns, at one point in the movie, Rey tells Luke that the First Order will control all the major systems within weeks, which is yet another unit of time or measurement mentioned in these new movies. Anyway, if it's going to take the First Order weeks to take over all the major systems, that implies that at least some of those systems are fighting back to some extent, which begs the question, why are something like 24 First Order Star Destroyers, including the Supremacy, their flagship, wasting 18 hours chasing 3 Resistance ships when they could be helping secure the galaxy they're trying to conquer? Are 24 Star Destroyers really going to be needed when the Resistance ships run out of fuel? We even see 2 of the 3 run out of fuel right in the movie, and a few shots and a matter of moments is all it takes for them to be destroyed. And let's just ignore the fact that as soon as they run out of fuel, they for some reason start to immediately slow down when they should just coast indefinitely at roughly the same speed, which makes the First Order's plan even worse. And yes, I do get that ending the Resistance threat forever is very important to the First Order, and maybe they're afraid the Resistance will try something or that other ships will come to aid them, so maybe their thinking here is them having more ships is just better. But if that is the case, why be so content to sit back and chase them for 18 hours? Giving them the possibility to try something or for help to arrive. Why isn't the First Order devising a plan to destroy them immediately so they can get back to conquering the rest of the galaxy? I mean, do you really think Tarkin or Vader, the guy who said asteroids do not concern me as his fleet was pummeled all for the sake of catching one small freighter, would have sat back and let it become a slow 18-hour pleasure cruise to nowhere? No, they would have swarmed those 3 Resistance ships with about 1,000 TIE fighters, despite the fact that the Star Destroyers couldn't support them. I mean, oh well, you might lose a lot of TIEs, but you're going to take out the last threat of the Resistance promptly and get back to taking over the rest of the galaxy. I don't think either of them would have cared about the losses. Hell, in Return of the Jedi, Palpatine even throws a bunch of TIEs at the Rebel fleet just to essentially be a distraction or annoyance. And though I could go on and on about the stupidity of the slow space chase, I digress. Because another problem with giving us the 18-hour window in The Last Jedi is it means Rey barely spends any time on Ahch-To with Luke. Because at the end of The Force Awakens, Starkiller Base has the Resistance base on Dakar targeted. They know exactly where it is. Which means if they're willing to have 24 Star Destroyers chase a Resistance fleet of 3 ships for 18 hours, I'd think they'd be all about sending a force to destroy that base as soon as possible after Starkiller Base failed to do it. Again, the opening crawl says the First Order reigns, so clearly they're not having any issues mobilizing their fleet or fleets, even in the wake of Starkiller's destruction. So I'm guessing as soon as it was destroyed, the Dreadnought was diverted to Dakar to destroy the base, right? I mean, taking out the Resistance is clearly a top priority. They'd get on that as soon as possible. Which then logically means Rey must have left Ahch-To very, very quickly after she got back to Dakar after Starkiller was destroyed. It then took her however long to actually get there, all the while the rest of the Resistance would have packed up their stuff and tried to escape before the First Order showed up, which would be very soon after Starkiller was taken out, again assuming they had no issues mobilizing, which they didn't seem to. Which then means, as is kind of shown in the movie, Rey gets to Ahch-To about the same time as the Dreadnought reaches Dakar to blow up the Resistance base, which then means, since Rey gets to the Supremacy before the space chase even ends, that she couldn't have been on Ahch-To for more than 18 hours or so, even less when we consider traveling time, though it seems as if she was actually there longer than that. But as sloppy as The Last Jedi is with time, when again it really didn't even need to give us that 18-hour window, The Rise of Skywalker is far worse and utterly destroys hyperspace travel in the process, because early in the film we learn that Palpatine will attack in 16 hours, and in that time, all of this happens, and I'm just going to follow Rey. She starts at the Resistance base, goes to Pisana, mingles a bit with the locals until the First Order shows up and chases them and they flee, where they then have a Goonies-style underground adventure before finding the Sith Dagger, at which point Kylo shows up and they have a little fight where Chewie is thought to be killed. She then goes to Kijimi, sneaks around for a little bit, finally runs into Zori Bliss, and they try to get the info from 3PO, which they ultimately do, and it leads them to the ocean moon of Endor. But wait, Rey senses that Chewie is still alive, so they infiltrate a Star Destroyer and have an adventure up there, before then finally going to the ocean moon. After encountering some former stormtroopers and waiting around for a little bit since the ocean is too dangerous, during which time everyone seems to forget they have only 16 hours before the attack happens, Rey eventually goes to the wreckage of the Death Star and has an encounter with Kylo Ren again, after which time she leaves and goes to Ahch-To, mopes around for a little bit before Luke fishes his old X-Wing out of the water and she manages to make any and all repairs it might need to make it flight-worthy. This crazy under 16-hour adventure, somehow, is then wrapped up by her flying to Exegol out in the unknown regions, where somehow she's eventually met by a massive fleet that has not only initially gathered somewhere else in this time, but then also has the time to travel to Exegol, again way out in the unknown regions. And all of this happens because no one was smart enough to say, you know what, maybe just take out that line about it being 16 hours. It doesn't add that much tension, and it really only makes it seem like hyperspace travel is instantaneous. But then again, early in this very same movie, they've already utterly wrecked hyperspace travel with Lightspeed skipping, or the idea that you can make short, uncharted hyperspace jumps to make a quick getaway, even though it doesn't work because when the Falcon does it in the movie, they are pursued by TIE fighters through hyperspace anyway, but more on all that insanity in a moment. Because first, let me say, and bear with me here, but I don't think, in theory, the idea of lightspeed skipping is bad. It actually makes a lot of sense that you could make a quick little jump through hyperspace to hopefully get away and not fly into anything in the process. And that maybe it wreaks havoc on your ship and or hyperdrive to do it, and that, again, you might just end up flying into something. The problems with the way it's done in the movie, however, are many. First, somehow the TIE fighters are able to perfectly track the Falcon as it's doing this, when again, this is a completely random jump, or is supposed to be. The idea, as far as I can tell, is the nav computer isn't plotting anything, and even Poe doesn't have any real clue where he's jumping to, or just how far he'll get, or any of that. And yet the TIE fighters are able to precisely follow the Falcon on this completely random jump, coming out of hyperspace still directly behind the Falcon, and they do this multiple times, which begs the question, why is this even a good tactic again? Plus, if this is a completely random jump, you should be emerging from hyperspace in the middle of nowhere, or in the middle of dead space every single time you try it. Even if you're roughly aiming at a system or planet, the odds of actually pulling it off without making any sort of calculations would be so high it'd likely fry poor C-3PO's brain if he tried to figure it out. And no, I'm no astrophysicist here by any stretch. It'd be like picking up a grain of sand and throwing it 50 feet towards another grain of sand and directly hitting it. And even that probably doesn't begin to accurately describe how empty most of space is, or the odds of light speed skipping into a system, much less the atmosphere of an actual planet, which Poe seems to do multiple times in a row. And before you come at me and say that perhaps this was somehow pulled off by the ship's computers, that even though precise coordinates weren't given to the nav computer, somehow it still managed to jump into the atmosphere of a planet. Hell, I guess Han pulled it off in The Force Awakens, right? Because that was so believable, managing to hit the narrow window between Starkiller's shields and the planet's surface. Anyway, even if you want to try and tell me that computers were pulling all this off, everything from coming out of hyperspace in the atmosphere of a planet to the TIE fighters precisely following an otherwise imprecise and random jump, right down to coming out of hyperspace directly behind the Falcon and being able to immediately start firing again, let's try and remember what Wedge said some 35 years prior to all this about something as relatively simple as an X-Wing being able to hit a 2-meter wide target with torpedoes. That's impossible, even for a computer. Okay, and for the sake of brevity, and because I've discussed it at length in multiple other videos, I'm not even going to discuss the Holdo maneuver here. But like lightspeed skipping, it's another example of something that really shouldn't have been done, because it turns something that is more or less a given, or something we don't have to think about, that being hyperspace travel, and makes us ask all sorts of questions. It opens Pandora's box, if you will, and takes something that we, in the back of our minds, know must be utterly complex and have all sorts of rules, but we can otherwise overlook it and just go with it, and it brings that to the forefront. And when that happens, instead of adding clarity or depth to the story, it tends to make us realize how ridiculous a lot of this is. And I think George Lucas knew and understood that. I think there's a reason why, after the first Star Wars movie, you pretty much never hear time mentioned. Why nothing more is ever done with hyperspace travel than getting a character or characters from point A to point B in a vague, undisclosed amount of time. Because when dealing with something like space travel, even in a completely fictional universe, something that the average person knows is obviously extremely complicated, but likely would have trouble explaining exactly why, and you pull back the curtain and try to use it in ways that are absurd and not all too consistent with even what a layman would know about it, you begin to wreck the story. You, again, take this thing that we can just sort of consider a given in Star Wars, that gets a free pass from nearly everyone, and you turn it into a glaring issue that many will now notice, and it begins to unravel the credibility of the story. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about the way time and hyperspace travel was handled in the sequel trilogy. Does it bother you or not? Do you think it's something that, in general, should be left alone? Because, again, it's something so complex that the more you bring it into the story, the more harm you do to it. Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.